What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's game day. You know what time it is. We're going to go over the top 18 tight ends, let you know a little bit about each matchup, how we overall feel about those tight ends, so you guys can head into your week 9 matchup with your expectations fully set. If you guys do have some tough start-sit decisions, please don't hesitate. Go to our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Members of our website not only gain access to the rankings, you'll get all of our waiver information, access to the trade model, sports betting picks, DFS picks, and more. So if that interests you, once again, that's at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link, as always, in the description box below. Before we do get into the video, though, stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was through 8 weeks, Davante Adams actually tied another wide receiver to be the highest performer in weighted opportunity rating. Which wide receiver was able to tie Adams in week 8? The correct answer was actually Terry McLaurin. Congratulations, Matthew Roberts, you got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, which tight end with at least 30 targets has the lowest percentage of their team's air yards? Once again, that's which tight end with at least 30 targets has the lowest percentage of their team's air yards. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado though, let's get right into the video. To start, we will go over the top 6 tight ends. No surprise here, Travis Kelce leads this list. When it comes to Kelce, there really isn't much that's needed to be said. Our fears of him potentially losing his volume from another blowout after suffering that same consequence against Denver the week before, he came out and posted one of his best fantasy days of the year, notching 8 total receptions, boasting his second highest target game of the season, even scoring through the air as well. This week he faces Carolina. The Panthers, while they are very scary against opposing wide receivers, but when it comes to tight ends, they're really nothing to be afraid about. Travis Kelce is also the closest thing to a matchup-proof tight end that we have in the league right now. This game comes in with the 4th highest projected total. So once again, we're expecting Kelce to have another big game because we really can't point to anything suggesting he's coming into a bad matchup. Moving over to Darren Waller though, I think we all can admit we were very disappointed with the production Waller produced, especially against Cleveland. Cleveland, as we know it, one of the worst defenses against tight ends, so it was pretty surprising to see him come out of that matchup, posting his second worst fantasy day of the season. Waller definitely isn't all to blame though. The offense as a whole, when it came to passing, it only produced 113 yards. Fear not though, this week he will definitely have a shot at redemption. He finds himself in another positive matchup. They're playing Justin Herbert and the Chargers. Herbert, as we know, has been forcing teams to shoot out. Even just a week ago, the Denver Broncos, who are known for having a slow offense, not typically finding themselves in matchups where they're putting up a lot of points, but in their game against Justin Herbert, that same offense was able to put up over 30. Las Vegas, clearly a much better offense. Their opponent this week has given up the 7th most fantasy points to that position. And we can't forget the LA Chargers have allowed 4 receiving touchdowns to tight ends throughout their last 4 games. Moving over to the next player though, we have Rob Gronkowski of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Gronk is definitely doing whatever he can to establish himself in this offense as a main contributor, and the results have definitely been showing on the field. He's now scored in back-to-back matchups. Heading into this one though, it quite literally couldn't get better. The New Orleans Saints give up the most fantasy points to that position in the entire league. So even though the fact that Antonio Brown joined the roster, meaning the competition for targets is likely at its highest it's ever been, he can more than make up for that by taking advantage of this soft matchup. And we all know with a player like Gronk, he simply doesn't need a massive amount of volume in order to get the job done for your fantasy team. Moving over to Mark Andrews though, it may not be as easy for him. He is now coming off of back-to-back games with disappointing performances and finds himself in week 9 faced against Indianapolis. Indy has been a very solid defense against tight ends for this entire year. To put it into perspective, Indy now has 3 games throughout this year where they've held the opposing team's tight ends to under 10 total receiving yards. In fact, there's only been 2 games this season where Indy has has allowed the opposing team's tight end position to eclipse 40 receiving yards, and even with 8 games behind them, they have still yet to allow a single receiving touchdown to that position. I will say though, in Andrews' defense, he is a major contributor in that offense. Even with no success, you know he will still get the volume. It of course also helps that they are on the road coming into this matchup as underdogs. But as Andrews owners, you gotta be aware the floor is low this week. The projected total, it's only 48 points. So there's no way we can act surprised if Mark Andrews has a bad game. The next player, though, we can definitely get excited for. That's Noah Fant of the Denver Broncos. Noah Fant is coming off of his highest reception game of the entire season. It was also the second most targets he had received in a week, and there's absolutely no reason we should expect his involvement to decrease from here. This week, they're playing Atlanta on the road. Atlanta, as we know, a very weak passing defense. Drew Lock, who's been trending upward. It's the perfect matchup for him to build off what he started last week. Denver will be coming into this game as 4-point road underdogs. The health of the receivers in Denver, it's all but guaranteed. And Noah Fant now has 5 or more receptions in 3 of his last 4 healthy games. The floor for Fant in this matchup, it's pretty high. The ceiling will always be limited by the offense. But if there ever was a week for Fant to play to his ceiling, it'd be in a matchup where they're 4-point road underdogs against a team with a very beatable pass defense, following a week in which Drew Lock played his best football. Rounding out the top 6 is of course TJ Hockenson. This one, very simple. Both of these defenses, they're really weak against the pass. This indicates a potential shootout. Kenny Golladay, he's already been ruled out, which means the potential volume for Hockenson is likely to increase, and we're already talking about Hockenson being a top 6 tight end in the league already. He's coming off a game in which he had double-digit targets, the most targets he's received all season, and it's very likely they continue to rely on him in what could possibly be one of his best matchups of the season. We're going to move over to the next 6 tight ends. These would be your mid to back end TE1s. To start, we have Hunter Henry. This week, Henry and the Chargers, they're playing against Las Vegas. While no, the Raiders have not allowed a ton of fantasy points to tight ends on the season, whenever they've been matched against a top quality tight end, those tight ends have been able to produce. Hunter Henry, he's had 19 targets over the last 3 weeks. While the touchdowns haven't been there, which has been hurting his fantasy days, his involvement in the offense, it's as high as we could realistically ask for. And with touchdowns being a byproduct of volume, the likeliness of Hunter Henry breaking this trend and being on the opposite side of variance, that type of situation could happen any week now. Just last week, the Raiders held the opposing wide receivers to a mere 5 receptions for 66 yards. If that's a trend that continues whatsoever, Hunter Henry's involvement may even be higher than it's been in recent weeks. The next player we have, Hayden Hurst of the Atlanta Falcons. Hayden Hurst and his involvement in his offense has definitely been increasing as well. 2 of his 3 highest target games of the season have actually come in both of the past 2 weeks. He posted 5 receptions against Carolina just a week ago. Rewind that, 2 weeks ago, we saw him post a season high 6 receptions versus the Detroit Lions. That type of volume is just uncommon for the tight end position, so whenever a player is receiving that type of volume, we have to take notice. And the Denver Broncos are not a defense we have to worry about when it comes to starting our fantasy tight ends against them. The next player we have is Jared Cook of the New Orleans Saints. I can understand why people would be weary of starting him with Michael Thomas back. The potential volume that is going to go to Michael Thomas may have potentially gone to Jared Cook. Regardless though, we gotta respect a guy who is now put together 3 consecutive games where he scored a receiving touchdown. And when it comes to the tight end position as a whole, when we're talking about back end TE1s or potential streaming options, most of them, they're touchdown or bust anyway. So Jared Cook, who's already been proven to be used heavily by New Orleans when it comes to putting up points, that's exactly the type of player you want to bet on. And with a 50.5 point projected total, New Orleans being road underdogs against Tampa Bay in this matchup, Jared Cook, he's still has some upside this week. Up next, we have Evan Engram of the New York Giants. While yes, he hasn't been all that efficient, not only has he had 19 targets over the past 2 weeks, the team's been trying to get him more involved in that, even with 3 rush attempts on the ground. Washington, they are one of the best defenses against wide receivers. If Daniel Jones struggles getting the ball to those playmakers, Evan Engram is certainly an outlet he's comfortable relying on. Unfortunately for Engram though, he has yet to score a touchdown on the season. While maybe that won't change this week, the high amount of volume, it gives him a high floor, and there have been 2 times throughout this season in which Washington has allowed multi-touchdown games to the opposing team's tight end position. The next player we have is Jonnu Smith of the Tennessee Titans. Jonnu Smith unfortunately has been trending downward. His involvement and his volume, it's been decreasing in each of the past 3 weeks, which is why even though he has a matchup that is top 5 in allowing fantasy points to his position, we still can't rank him as a top 6 tight end. He's a back-end TE1 in this one. The Tennessee Titans, it seems as though the offense in the passing game is transitioning more to the wide receiver position. Regardless though, we respect his talent. We can't say we'd be all that surprised if he scores a touchdown. He's had 2 multi-TD games this season, so while his floor might not be all that high, we know he has a ceiling to make up for that. The final top 12 tight end we have is Eric Ebron of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I can understand why people may be weary of starting him. Anytime we've felt comfortable so far this season in putting him in, the result, it's really only left us disappointed. But with such a limited amount of options and a really juicy matchup against Dallas, taking a gamble on a player who's coming off of his second best game of the season, a game in which he played on over 85% of the offensive snaps, taking a gamble on that type of player, even if it doesn't pan out, it's not as if you can feel that bad about it. With Dallas being such a mess on offense, Pittsburgh's likely to have a lot of offensive opportunities, potentially more targets going the way of Ebron, and more volume for a player who's been trending upward. A better game than he posted last week is definitely in the cards in this matchup. We're moving over to the next 6 tight ends. These would be your potential pivot plays, your streaming options. And to start, Mike Gesicki. We already know the talent that he brings to the table. Unfortunately, the offense is looking like it's held back from the inexperience of Tua. Just keep in mind, we're not saying that Tua can't improve or what we've seen from him is likely to continue for the remainder of the season. But whenever a player like Mike Gesicki is only receiving 2 targets in a game, producing just 1 reception on the week, there's no way we could trust him as a TE1. Historically though, young and inexperienced quarterbacks tend to rely more on the tight end position. If there were a player to likely increase week over week when it comes to volume or production, the most likely player that would definitely be Mike Gesicki. Up next, we have Logan Thomas of the Washington football team. Washington will be in a divisional bout versus the New York Giants. On paper, not a defense you want to start your tight ends against. Technically, they rank top 10 in mitigating fantasy points to that position. However, Logan Thomas has now scored a touchdown in each of the past 2 games. He also scored a touchdown against the Giants when they played earlier this season. Just keep in mind, he has only had 4 targets for the past 4 games. That is by no means a high amount of volume, which in turn means his floor could be really, really low. This start is definitely a more feast or famine type of play, but considering he's produced against this team the last time he faced them and has not played a game in which he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 6, putting a bet on that type of player, no one can really fault you for doing it. The next player we have, Jimmy Graham of the Chicago Bears. Unfortunately for him, he went from being a TE1 to somebody falling to a back-end TE2. When it comes to the results he's put on the field, he's heading into he just had his 3rd straight game in which he has not scored a touchdown. For a player who has only eclipsed 34 receiving yards in just just one game this season. That's not going to be acceptable. It won't get it done. So while truthfully, we would have him lower in the ranks, the fact of the matter is that this is actually a pretty solid matchup for him. The Tennessee Titans are heavy favorites in this one. They also haven't been particularly good at defending opposing tight ends. So if Jimmy Graham were to get himself out of the slump, we could certainly see it be in this game, but he just hasn't shown us anything to this point for us to feel confident in that result. The next player we have is Irv Smith Jr. Irv Smith Jr. was a player who was trending upward prior to their last game. In that game where we expected him to perform well, the end result was 1 target, 1 reception, and 16 receiving yards. So our faith in him overall and producing in what could possibly be a solid matchup, a higher volume day for the Minnesota Vikings, our faith in that being the outcome for him, we can't say it's all that high. However, this game definitely has the potential to be one where Kirk Cousins throws the most pass attempts he has all season, and if that volume does increase, Irv Smith Jr. is the next man up. What we've seen from him while on the field in limited opportunities, it has given us confidence to say that if he is getting the volume, we believe he can produce. The main question is, are there going to be enough attempts for all of these receivers to feast? And if not, the odd man out is likely Irv Smith. The next player we have up is Dalton Schultz of the Dallas Cowboys. Dalton Schultz is coming off a game which was his first high volume game since Dak Prescott went out with an injury, and there's always that chance that this is a trend that could possibly continue. Inexperienced quarterbacks or ones that are struggling, they tend to utilize the tight end with frequency, and considering the fact that they're playing Pittsburgh this week, we can almost guarantee they're playing from behind all game. The scoring opportunities though will overall be limited, meaning the ceiling for Schultz, it's not going to be that high, and the reality is his floor is not high either. The final player we have is Trey Burton of the Indianapolis Colts. I believe a lot of you out there will be questioning why we have him so low, and while yes, we understand he's had 4 touchdowns over just 2 weeks of play. Half of his touchdowns, they came on rushing plays. Those types of unique situations, it would be silly to rely on week over week. We've also seen the involvement for other tight ends increase over that same span, meaning the volatility for a player like Burton, it is much higher than meets the eye. This matchup may seem beatable on paper, but we definitely think the Baltimore Ravens defense is a bit underrated, and there's no denying Trey Burton has been playing at his ceiling. But guys, that's gonna do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.